This is She Creates Business, a podcast for wedding pros. Your host, Kinsey Roberts, interviews incredible women in the wedding industry who are making their mark and creating success on their terms. Join the conversation.
Well, hey there and happy Tuesday. Welcome to episode 49 of She Creates Business, a podcast for wedding pros. This is your host, Kinsey Roberts, and thank you so much for joining me today. We are so close to episode 50, which is happening on Thursday. I cannot wait. It feels good to say episode 50. Anyway, today, you guys, I'm solo on the show, and I am talking about 11 ways to market your podcast. Last Tuesday in episode 47, I actually talked about podcast topics and themes that you could maybe adopt if you have been wanting to start your own show, but you don't know what you would talk about, and you are having a hard time brainstorming what you would want your podcast to be about. So if you haven't listened to episode 47, I actually specifically cater that episode to wedding professionals. So if you've been listening and thinking to yourself, I'd love to start my own show, I just have no clue what I would podcast about, go and listen to episode 47 and then come back to today's episode where I'm giving you 11 ways to market your podcast. Some of these ways are very obvious and some not so obvious. And so I think that the best thing to do is kind of just jump right into it and get going and let you know what I think are great ways to market the podcast and what ways have really been beneficial to this show. Because as you may or may not know, I started 7 months ago with literally, I think maybe 25 followers on Instagram, and with the people who had said yes to being my guest from the Creative at Heart conference, and that is it. That's the only following I had, you guys. I didn't have a website. I didn't have an email list. Nothing like that. Not even close. So these ways to market my podcast have been really instrumental in growing the show and growing my listenership and meeting new people and just, all the amazing things that come along with having your own podcast. So like I said, there's 11 ways to market your podcast in today's episode. So why don't we just jump right into it? I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Podcasting for Creatives, my course for creative women entrepreneurs to create, publish, and grow their very own podcast. This course launched yesterday, March 20th, and it is going to be starting. So it launched yesterday. You're welcome to purchase now. And class starts next Monday, the 27th. So feel free to hop on in there. And if that's something you're interested in, head to bit.ly/let's podcast and take a peek. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me as well at kinsey@vistaviewevents.com. Alrighty, let's get into 11 ways to market your podcast or your future podcast. The first one, and I think, again, some of these are very obvious, but let's talk about them. I think this goes without saying, is social media. And specifically, the social media accounts that do the best for you in terms of your business, if you are attaching your podcast to your business. As I mentioned, when I first started, I didn't really have an online business. I sort of had a business built around the podcast because, of course, I own Vistaview Events, which is a wedding venue in Colorado. That's why I started a podcast that interviewed wedding professionals, because I am a wedding professional or wedding entrepreneur. But I didn't have a following on the podcast side. I definitely let our venue people, the people who were interested in our venue, know about the podcast, but it didn't really correlate too much because they were mostly couples, right? They're people who are interested in getting married over on Vistaview Events, not people who are interested in the business side of being a wedding pro. So but as I've grown the podcast and as I've grown the business, I've really relied on social media to get the word out. And I'll tell you what works best for me is Instagram, of course. Instagram works great for me. I've been able to grow that to over 1,200 followers, which doesn't sound like a lot to a lot of people. Some people have thousands and thousands and thousands. But for me, again, starting from absolutely nobody and absolutely from scratch like 7 months ago, I feel really good about it. And I have a very niche down podcast and I feel great about those numbers. Similarly, Instagram stories. I get tons of engagement on Instagram stories and a lot of views, just versus how many followers I have. So I feel like those are awesome. Don't forget to mention your podcast in your stories. Don't forget to just remind people in your Instagram posts that this Instagram account is for a podcast. especially if you're not going to create a separate Instagram for your podcast and you're just going to run it on, let's say, your current Instagram account where you run your wedding business. Definitely be posting about it consistently so that people know, oh yeah, that's right, she has a podcast, and put it in your Instagram bio that you're a podcaster. And in that same train of thought, Facebook, we all have a love-hate relationship with it. I love Facebook. I totally don't mind paid ads. And Facebook Live. I have not done a Facebook Live on my personal Facebook page yet, or my business page yet, because I'm terrified. But I see a lot of people doing Facebook Lives, and they get tons of engagement on them. So I recommend that. I'm recommending it to myself because I need to jump on that train. But I like Facebook. I will put I have a business page for the podcast. I advertise on there the podcast, each podcast episode separately. So I'll do like my Instagram, my graphic with the guest on it and things of that nature. And I enjoy it. And I also will link up to other stuff. So Facebook, of course, Pinterest. Don't forget Pinterest. I think a lot of podcasters, maybe not in the creative space, because we've really adopted Pinterest heavily into our business, especially if we're in the wedding industry. So I'm going to say that if you're listening now, you probably would remember Pinterest right away. But what I've seen with other podcasters, especially if they're in like the online marketing space, they don't really utilize Pinterest. So utilize Pinterest. I see lots of engagement on Pinterest. I, do a blog post, which is called show notes for each episode. And then I make a Pinterest image, and of course I pin it to Pinterest. So use Pinterest to drive traffic back to your website and to your show notes so that you can gain new listeners. Twitter. I don't know if you have a Twitter account. I have one for She Creates Business. I actually recently deleted my Twitter account for Vista View Events, our venue, because our ideal client is not on Twitter. Brides are not searching Twitter for vendors, at least not for venues. And so I don't mess with Twitter on the venue side, and I feel really good about that decision. But I do have a Twitter account for the podcast because Twitter is really for like journalists, and podcasters are definitely on there, and people who have been on Twitter since 2009. And so if you appropriately use like the podcast hashtag or the podcasting hashtag, you might gain some new followers there, and you really never know whose eye you're going to catch. What I've heard a lot, researched a lot, is that journalists, writers, authors are all on Twitter, and they're utilizing Twitter, on the daily, multiple times a day. And so, again, you never know whose eye you're going to catch. It might not be listeners to your show, but on Twitter, it might be someone who wants to write about you, which is just as great, right? That goes along with marketing. Your personal page. So your personal Facebook page, if you feel comfortable, you totally don't have to, but your own personal Facebook page, definitely let your friends and family know that you have a podcast. Again, I know that some of us are kind of like, oh, my friends and family don't get what we do online. But if you feel comfortable with it, you never know what kinds of podcasts they'd be interested in, or maybe they don't even know about podcasting yet, and you would be the perfect start for them. So let your friends and family know that you have a podcast on your personal Facebook page. Speaking of Facebook, idea number 2 for marketing your future podcast or your current podcast is in Facebook groups. Now, I'm going to caveat this and say there's a couple of ways you can do this in Facebook groups without being one of those annoying people who just spam the group with all of their stuff. Only promote your podcast on promotion days. Facebook groups, especially the ones that I'm part of, like the Wedding Business Bosses and the Heart-Centered Biz Bosses and Savvy Business Owners, they all have specific days of the week where you can promote your stuff, whether it be a blog post, whether it be somewhere you were published, or your podcast episodes. And so I wait specifically for those days to plug the podcast specifically. So today, I will say if it's a promotion day in my Facebook groups, I will say I published, episode whatever about 10 ways to market your podcast. And I link up in that Facebook group only on those days, because you want to be respectful of the rules. And I know as a member of those groups and as an ambassador to 2 of those groups, nobody wants to tolerate spam, and we just don't. So we delete it if it's not allowed. So just mind the rules. Everybody will appreciate that. And also it'll be better for you because people will actually be looking at those prompts because it's the promotion day. Link to your episodes when it's relevant. So if it's not on a promotional day, I don't see anything wrong with if somebody asks a question that is very specifically related to a podcast episode that you published, answer their question and then say, I also did a podcast episode about this recently. Here's the link if you're interested. if it's going to help them and you're not just trying to promote yourself, I feel like it's very acceptable to do that. So if that, like, for example, if someone asked in a podcast, or if someone asked in a Facebook group, hey, what are some new ideas for marketing my podcast? I would answer them. And then I would also say, hey, I just published a podcast about this. You might like it. And I would link up to this episode. So something to think about there. And then if somebody asks a specific question that you know the answer to, then, and maybe it's about podcasting, maybe it's about the wedding industry, just make sure you're kind of answering those questions so that you are present and you're kind of top of mind for people as being someone who is helpful. Many times in groups, when someone answers my questions, like I'll ask questions, if some people answer, I go and look at their Facebook page, because I want to know who they are, especially if I don't know them. I want to get to know people. That's the point of Facebook groups. And so then I'll see, oh, she's a podcaster, or she owns this floral shop, or whatever. And people will get to know you that way. So if you're present and being active in Facebook groups, then, on the days where you do promote or link to relevant episodes, it just goes that much further. Okay, number 3 way to market your show is if you have an interview show, by utilizing your guests. Now, I've heard other podcasters say they've had a lot of problems with their guests marketing their show, and I can see that. I can definitely see that, because my thought is always this: it is not my guest's job to market my podcast. It's my job, right? I brought them on the show because they are the expert, and it's my job to market their episode. When I get my guests to share their episode, that's just icing on the cake, and I greatly appreciate it. And I do that in a couple of ways. I make it really easy for my guests to share the show. I always remind them when their episode is going live. So I give them the schedule. I say it'll go live on this date. Then I remind them the day before. I have been a little lackadaisical about that. Poor Megan Ely. I emailed her the day of, or the very night before, like, sorry about the late notice. But I emailed them the night before typically. And then I also provide them the graphic that I'll be using and ask them to share it too. I say, you are more than welcome to use this. Please know that it's, by no means a requirement, since I know you might have pre-planned social posts, but they always want to share it. And I love that. I appreciate it. If you have any verbiage that you want them to share, or that they could share, if you've written a little snippet for Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, include that in your email and say, here's some snippets you can use if you would like to. Here's hashtags that you can use. And it just makes it so easy. They either send it off to their social media person or they load it up themselves. So make it very easy for them to share. And I believe that they will, especially if you built rapport with them during the interview, which you should have. They will absolutely share their own episode. Okay, podcast number 4. Marketing idea number 4 is this one, and I haven't really tested it yet, but it's totally an option. Podcast directories. So Libsyn is who I use as my podcast host, and I'm automatically included in their directory with the the subscription package that I buy every month. So that's a directory that I'm included in. My course, Podcasting for Creatives, I created a directory of podcasts so that people could look at those podcasts to see if they would like to pitch the host to be on their show, or if they would like to pitch themselves to be a guest on those podcasts. It was kind of an extra bonus for my students. And so be on the lookout for people who have podcasting courses like mine. If you start a podcast and you want to be included in my directory, then let me know. And then another one, I saw this in a Facebook group actually just the other day. Samantha Johnson from Covell, she was asking people to take a survey for her because they were thinking of creating a podcast directory. I think it would be in line with Covell, their on their platform for women to connect with each other in business. It's awesome. You should definitely check them out. And so that's an option. It's not created yet, but I'm sure it very soon will be, or depending on when you're listening to this in the future, check out Covell and Samantha Johnson and see if they created that directory and see if you could be a part of it. Number 5 way to, I'm talking really fast today, you guys, so I have a distinct feeling that this is going to be a shorter episode, but I'm sure you're okay with that. You have lots of stuff to do. You're busy, girl. Number 5 way to market your podcast is link to your podcast in your email signature. If you don't have a professional email signature with a link to your website, your social media handles, and your podcast, you should totally get one and put your picture in there while you're at it. I cannot tell you, I'll actually give you an example of this in a second, where people have found my podcast or even my website from the link in my signature. And they are always like, oh, hey, I was checking out your venue, because I have my venue link in there as well, or your podcast or whatever it is. And I love it. It's so easy. It'll take you 2 seconds to do. Put it in your email every time you send an email. And you just never know who is looking, especially for something like that is so easy and you only have to do it once. Like, you put it in there once, and unless you want to actually update your signature, like update your photo or whatever, you don't have to change it. And it's just out there. Think of how many emails you're sending on a daily basis. I love that option, and it's often overlooked. Okay, number 6, be a guest on other podcasts. I have mentioned this before, especially I think I was talking about how to be a great guest on other podcasts. I think I mentioned this in that episode, but be a guest on other podcasts, especially if you're a podcaster. It is one of the fastest ways to grow your audience. When I am a guest on other shows, I always provide those listeners with some kind of special download. And I always give them a special link, and I know who is coming to my website from that episode that I was a guest on. And I suggest you do that as well. And listen to my How to Be a Great Guest episode if you want more tips on that. But then I know how being a guest on other podcasts is performing for me. And I want to know that information. If you don't want to know, then don't listen to me. But I want to know that information because I want to make sure that my time is being well spent in those marketing efforts. But it's seriously one of the fastest ways to grow your podcast, because podcast listeners don't just listen to one podcast. They listen to a lot. And the word binge listen is like, I'm going to make a t-shirt of it or something. Everyone does that, right? We binge listen to podcasts. We binge watch Netflix, and so on. So be a guest on other podcasts and make it relevant to your show. But don't be afraid to branch out. If you're a wedding planner, you don't just have to go on wedding and couple and bridal podcasts. If you have other interests outside of that, again, podcast listeners listen to a lot of shows, and you never know who is listening. I always give the example of the podcast, What Should I Read Next?, hosted by Anne Bogle. I'm in the wedding industry, and I'll tell you right now that even though that podcast is about reading, if she ever has someone on who has anything to do with the wedding industry, you can be sure I'll be looking that person up because I'm in the wedding industry too. So you never know who's listening. So don't be afraid to branch out and be a guest on shows that are also your personal interests or your passion projects or whatever. Number 7, a way to grow your podcast and market your podcast is your email list. Especially if your email list is not directly tied to your podcast, like if you are a planner or something of that nature, or a florist or another creative. If your email list isn't directly tied to your podcast, make sure you are mentioning every now and again that, hey, remember, I host XYZ podcast. My podcast, or my email list for shecreatesbusinesspodcast.com, is directly related to my podcast. And so I always just update them with the episodes and everything. But that's another tip. I don't just assume my email list knows what's coming out. I send them who's going to be on the show, what episodes they missed last week, so that they know. It's kind of the same thing they say about your blog, right? Even though you have people on your email list, doesn't mean they're coming to your blog every day. So you should let them know, hey, today I blogged about this, or this week in blogging, this is coming up. Same thing with your podcast. Let your email list know. If you decide to start a podcast that is really more of a passion project based on your hobby, and you just do not see how it correlates, it could just be something where you add in a PS, or I bet, maybe you do a special section. I bet you didn't know this about me. So for what I mean by that is, let's say you're a caterer and you start a podcast about scrapbooking because you're really into that. And it's going really well and you love it. You might just shoot an email to your catering list and, at the end, just say PS, or add that little into, today I want to tell you something you might not know about me for fun. Did you know I host a podcast all about scrapbooking? Maybe they won't care. Some people might. You never know. But utilize your email list. Why not, right? Okay, number 8. This is 8. Oh my gosh, this is the one we forget. The people that we don't know online, so the people that we know face-to-face, the people that we know locally, they may A, not even know what a podcast is, or B, not know that you have one. So pretty please advertise your podcast locally. Make sure you're letting local people know that you have a podcast. And this is often forgotten. So if you're going to local meetups, I know savvy business owners have local meetups. who else has local meetups? The Rising Tide Society has local meetups. If you are going to those kinds of local creative meetups, make sure you let people know that you have a podcast. It's a great place to do that. Make sure you let friends and family know. This kind of goes back to sharing on your personal Facebook page. Make sure you let your friends and family know. If you go to like a reunion for your schooling or whatever, make sure you let people know. It's a great way to let online friends know that you have a show in iTunes and other places. I'll give you a really good example of this. The other day, I was on the phone with a woman named Amy, and she was wonderful. And we were actually discussing advertising in the magazine Wedding Sites and Services, which is a Colorado-based vendor magazine for wedding professionals. And her and I actually just started talking about personal stuff at the beginning. Props to you, Amy. She's a great salesperson. She wasn't just like, hey, put an ad in my magazine right away. We started talking about personal stuff. And so, of course, I told her about my podcast because we're both in the wedding industry. And we talked about that for a good 20 minutes. And if I would have never mentioned it, she would never know. But now this awesome woman knows about my podcast, and she was local. And it's might lead to other things down the road. So don't be afraid to share with your local friends and local people you know about your show. Number 9, your marketing material. So by this, I mean your business card. If you have client like prospect cards that you use at your venue or at your planning studio or your photography studio, whatever it is, make sure you put on there, you create a unique link, like a bit.ly link for your podcast, and put on there that you're a podcaster, and maybe link up to the website or link up to your iTunes channel. With a shortened link. I'll give you a funny example about this. I was on my way home from the Together experience, and I was flying with Raina Pomeroy, and I happened to be on the same flight, so we sat together, and her and I talked a ton about podcasting because you may know she's the co-host of the Creative Empire podcast, which I love. And so, of course, we talked all things podcasting for a good majority of the flight, and in addition to some other things. And I noticed this guy in front of us kept like kind of looking back at us, and I was just like, what is this guy's deal? And right when we got up out of our seats when the plane arrived, he was like, hey, where were you? Like, were you talking about podcasting? And we were like, yeah, we're both podcasters. And he was like, oh my gosh, he loved podcasts. He listened. He was like a podcast junkie, just like me and Raina. His favorite was John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneur on Fire. So of course I told him that Raina had been a guest on there. And then his eyes like bugged out in his head, like, oh my gosh, I'm talking to someone who's on John Lee Dumas's podcast. It was awesome. But we got to know him and his business. It seems like he's doing some Amazon FBA stuff. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but he asked for us for our cards. And I, of course, did not have any, like a total amateur, but Raina did. And I think on her business card, it says she's a podcaster. So that was like a random connection, but amazing, right? And an opportunity for us to say, hey, we're fellow podcast lovers. We're also hosts. And Raina gave him her card. So that was really fun. So you just never know when you're going to be able to pass out your marketing material. Make sure people know that you have a podcast. Number 10, we're getting down to the wire here. Sponsor stuff, you guys. Sponsor conferences, sponsor courses, sponsor, education series, sponsor retreats, workshops, even local workshops, maybe those local meetups like local Rising Tide Society meetups or local Savvy business owner meetups. I don't know if they would actually do that, but I am a sponsor for Megan Martin's Propel series, which is an educational program that she's running for aspiring and new wedding planners. And I'm sponsoring that education course, and I'm sponsoring with cute little branded earbuds. And so it's a perfect fit. It's for wedding planners or aspiring wedding planners. This is a show for wedding pros, and what a great fit that is. I also sponsored the Together experience recently that I just came back from in Portland, and I did live podcast interviews there. I had a little podcast lounge, and it was wonderful. I met a lot of women in the wedding industry there, and I really enjoyed my time. So sponsor those things. And then finally, and along with sponsoring conferences and retreats and workshops, is when you attend conferences, retreats, and workshops, even locally, make sure you let people know that you have a podcast, especially in the small groups. A lot of retreats and workshops these days will have like breakout sessions into smaller groups from the overall larger group. And when you go around and introduce yourself, make sure you're saying, I own, et cetera, like Vista View Events, wedding venue, and I'm also a podcaster. She creates business. I actually did that at the Together experience when we went around in our wedding industry circle, and I told them, I own Vista View Events and here's my podcast. And one of the girls was so funny. She was like, oh my God, I knew I recognized your voice. She didn't know me and we hadn't met yet. But she was like, I listened to your podcast and I thought I recognized your voice. And that was hilarious and amazing. So let people know that you have a podcast. So you might be thinking to yourself, Kinsey, some of these are like word of mouth, or a lot of them are. And the answer is, yeah, they are. That's still a really amazing way to get business, you guys. Don't forget that. Yes, we can do the social media, we can do the Facebook groups, but word of mouth and referral-based business and marketing is still an amazing way to get business. And a lot of you are probably shaking your heads like, yep, I get a lot of my business from fellow vendors. There's no difference in your podcast or your future podcast. I get a lot of new people listening because they've said, my friend recommended you to me. And it feels great. So there you have it, friends. That's 11 ways to market your current podcast or your future podcast. Hopefully you're going to have a podcast. I would love to see more women in podcasting. That is for sure. And I hope that works for you. Let me know. Let me know your thoughts on these. I've certainly enjoyed them and they've really helped me grow this show and have you as a listener. Thank you so much for taking time to be with me today. I greatly appreciate you. And I will see you on Thursday for episode 50.
Thank you so much for listening to She Creates Business. Please take a minute and head to iTunes to leave an honest review so we can help more wedding pros find the show.